Today's project is a 1998 Lincoln Town Car. The original engine suffered catastrophic damage after being driven through high water. I purchased a used engine from a salvage yard. They guaranteed the long block, so I replaced or cleaned and repaired everything else. Today I'm installing a brand new AGM battery and testing the fuel system before starting the motor for the very first time. To securely mount the battery in the box, slide it back and then slide it forward so the wedge on the battery slides underneath the lip of the battery box. Next, install the hold-down clamp and tighten the long bolt with a 1/4-inch ratchet. Always install the positive battery cable first and disconnect the negative battery cable first. This technique will prevent sparks or injury if the tool makes contact with the ground while touching the positive battery terminal. Carefully support the fuel line clips as you pry them free, or else you can do what I did and spend 10 minutes looking for it. To remove the fuel lines from the manifold, you'll need a special tool. It slides along the fuel line and releases the circumferential spring. To disconnect the line, first press the fuel line forward to seat it, and then press the tool against the spring and then pull back together. If the connector is stubborn, try lubricating it and rotating the tool side to side as you pull. I placed the pressure and return line in a glass jar so I could check for fuel contamination, water, and fuel flow. With the fuel lines disconnected, I turned the motor over to build up oil pressure and lubricate the cylinders and prevent a dry start. When I returned to the engine compartment, I found a dry jar. The first step in the troubleshooting process is to check the fuel pump fuse. Look in the owner's manual for the location of the fuse. The second step is to check the fuel filter for obstructions. The fuel filter is located on the frame rail forward of the passenger's rear wheel. To disconnect the fuel line, you must first pry down on the plastic hair clip. It does not need to be removed fully. Doing so will often result in breakage. With the hair clip released, the fuel line will disconnect without any special tools. Have a container ready when you disconnect the line and be careful not to get the fuel in your eyes. A kitchen sink hose sprayer can make a suitable eye wash in case of emergency. Just lower the temperature and decrease the pressure and rinse your eye carefully. Keep in mind the fuel filter is half full when you pull it from the bracket. When you reinstall the filter, be sure the arrow is facing forward. Fuel filters can only go in one way. Be sure to fully seat the connector so the hairpin fits on the other side of the shoulder. After installing the clips, tug on the connector to make sure it's not going to pop loose under fuel pressure. Insert the fuel supply line and the return line into the pressure manifold and install the clips. The next step is to remove the fuel tank and test the fuel pump. To begin removing the fuel tank, open the gas cap door, remove the cap, and remove the 3 screws holding the filler neck. To complete the removal of the filler neck, there is a bracket in the wheel well above the frame with a single bolt that must be removed. Remove the hairpin clip from the fuel filler vent line. Rotate the filler neck until the vent line clears the body, then rotate back and forth, gradually wiggling it free from the fuel tank grommet. I discovered later that the tip of the fuel filler neck check valve fell off into the tank when I was pulling it free from the grommet. The fuel line safety clip must be lifted and pivoted forward toward the fuel line to disengage the 2 teeth from the fuel line connector. Fuel-injected automobiles have 2 fuel lines, a pressure line and a return line from the fuel pressure regulator back to the fuel tank. With the fuel line safety clip disconnected and tucked out of the way, it's time to insert the fuel line disconnect tool. To remove the fuel line, first you must seat the fuel line completely and then press in on the fuel tool and it will pull free. With the fuel line disconnected, let's discuss how the tool releases the connector. The fuel hose quick disconnect contains a circumferential spring that engages with the shoulder on this fuel line. Then the fuel line disconnect tool can expand the spring, slipping it over the shoulder and release the connector. With two 12-inch extensions and an impact driver, I was able to remove the fuel tank strap bolts. With the straps removed, I lowered the tank to the ground with a car jack because it still contained about 5 gallons of gas. To slide a half-full fuel tank out from under the car without the risk of sparks, I slipped it up on top of a mechanic's creeper and rolled it away. For those of you who've seen my other video on how to remove water from gas, this is where the fuel came from. To remove the fuel pump and sending unit as one piece, you remove about 6 screws and carefully remove the panel. To quickly allow me to identify the correct location, I put a small swath of paint. The float is suspended on a thin wire arm and must be carefully removed to prevent damage. To remove the fuel pump from the sending unit, you must remove the single screw from the clamp. You must remove the hose clamp from the fuel line and the electrical connector. I reinstalled the screws for the fuel tank access panel so they wouldn't get lost while I was waiting for the new fuel pump to come in. This is the nose piece from the fuel filler check valve. To test the fuel pump, I clamped it in a vise and connected the terminals to a 12-volt battery while touching the side of the motor to see if I could feel vibration. The new fuel pump requires some minor assembly. First, slip on the rubber isolation damper, aligning the opening for the fuel strainer. The rubber fuel line from the old pump was deteriorated. We will install a new length of rubber tube that was included in the kit and install the clamp. The fuel strainer does not come with the fuel pump, but is required by the manufacturer to keep the fuel pump in warranty. To seat the fuel strainer retaining clip, position it and then tap it into place with a small socket. The sheathing on the electrical harness is deteriorated and flaking away. It must be replaced so it doesn't plug up the new fuel strainer. When I flexed the fuel line, the cracking became obvious. When installing the fuel pump, care must be taken for alignment of the clamps and the electrical connections. To ensure the tank was dry and free of contamination, I used a leaf blower. Before installing the sending unit, I cleaned the gasket surface and the mating area with alcohol. Then I carefully negotiated the sending unit into the fuel tank and oriented it back to the original paint marking. I installed the bolts in a crisscross sequence and torqued them to specification. Next, I connected the electrical connector to the top of the tank and the fuel vent line. The fuel filler neck was severely rusted, so I cleaned it with a wire wheel mounted in a rotary tool. To finish the job, I coated it with a can of paint specially designed for rusted surfaces. This nut plate was seized and came free with the stud. I replaced all the tank mounting hardware with OEM parts I was able to purchase from eBay. After inserting the nut plate through the special pocket, I used the stud to align the nut plate with the hole. I slid the tank into position and hoisted it up into the opening with a cargo strap attached to the frame and underneath the body of the car, back to the bumper. Before connecting any fuel lines, I ran the electrical harness up through the cavity and plugged it in. Then I connected the fuel pressure and return lines and tested to make sure they were fully seated. This clip was slowed down so you could see how the fuel clip engages in the connector. I always hand start the hardware to prevent cross-threading and torque to final value. This fuel vent line is above the passenger side rear wheel. I lubricated the fuel filler neck with Vaseline to prevent damage to the fuel tank grommet during installation. The fuel filler neck must be rotated during installation to allow the overflow tube to pass through the cutout in the fender well. When the fuel filler neck is fully seated, connect the overflow tube. Withdraw the filler tube slightly and seat it to the gas cap door opening, and then install the 3 screws and secure the gas cap. If you learned something from this video, please like and share. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. Thank you for watching.